Good morning, Ken, from a beautiful, tranquil place. We may hear a little bit about that later on. We are now at key number 1. It's about leadership, and especially the article that you wrote on establish strong, collaborative, mediative leadership. And before we get into the article, I would like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself.
So by way of background, I have been a mediator now for 40 years. And I have mediated virtually every kind of dispute that you can think of. I've done thousands of divorces, hundreds and hundreds of marriages, family disputes, organizational conflicts, conflicts between nation states, transnational, cross-cultural, organizational, environmental, large group, multi-stakeholder consensus building processes, you name it. And in each of these, the mediator plays a very distinct kind of leadership role, one that is ordinarily not thought of as being leadership because it's not the principal spokesperson. It's not the person who is standing out in front, you know, sort of telling everybody what to do. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of that. You can think of it as leading from within or leading from behind or a surround form of leadership. But fundamentally, it is collaborative. And what I've learned in the course of this work is how important it is to work, to develop people's capacity to lead their own lives.
Wow. So after thousands and thousands of mediations that you did within virtually each type or background of mediation, you come to the conclusion that, in fact, the main added value of a mediator is that he is, in fact, mediating change and having some kind of mediative, collaborative leadership, and that is the most important role of the mediator. So not saying this is what you need to do, but actually helping the participants to become leaders themselves. That is what I hear you say. So,
yes, like conflict, leadership is a relationship. And that relationship can take a variety of different forms. First of all, there are power-based forms of leadership, just as there are power-based approaches to conflict. And those require winners and losers. That is a form of leadership for some and against others. Secondly, there is a rights-based form of leadership, which is predominantly legal. But once again, there are winners and losers. One side wins in court, the other side loses. If you vote, one side wins and the other side loses. And the problem is, what happens if the issue that you're trying to resolve has more than one side? If there is more than one truth? And the answer is, by forcing a conclusion that allows only one of those sides or one of those truths to win and the other one loses, you have collapsed a complex, multifaceted, very rich source of information into something that is overly simplistic, into something that fundamentally will fail, into something that is necessarily adversarial. So there's a third approach, which is the approach of interests. And the interest-based approach does not require a winner or a loser. And therefore, leadership takes a fundamentally different form. And here, the goal of leadership is not winning. It is learning. It is figuring out how to solve our problems together. And as a planet, we are now facing problems that can no longer be solved using power or rights-based solutions. You can't use military force to stop climate change. or species extinction or the pandemic. You can't go to court to stop coronavirus. Instead, what you have to do is you have to learn how to work collaboratively. And that requires a unique form of leadership in which the mediator is a kind of leader and the leader is a kind of mediator. Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching millennia ago, said that the greatest leader is the one whose name is not even known among the people.
Wow.
The second greatest is the one who is loved, and the third greatest is the one who's feared.
Wow.
And I think that kind of describes what we are looking at. The ideal of mediation is that you have no idea of who the mediator was or what they did. You believe you did it yourself. So this is the kind of leadership that a parent gives a child. It's not saying, do it the way I tell you to do it, or do it because others tell you to do it that way. Those are power and rights-based forms. But do it in your own way. And here are some guidelines that can help you think about how to do it and make choices that will ultimately be successful for you. But the choice has to be yours. And that's what democracy is.
Okay, wow, that is a beautiful round of many of these concepts that you described in your article that come together. So would you say that, in fact, that mediation is learning to collaborate, learning others to collaborate and doing it behind the scenes, actually, to give them the illusion that they, maybe illusion is not the good word, but the feeling that they are making the change and the decisions themselves, but that it's about the learning and the collaboration behind the scenes.
Yes, except that once again, it becomes complex. So you can't do that if you haven't figured out what the real problem is. So for example, in a couple, you may have an argument over spending money. One person thinks that you should spend less and the other person thinks that you should spend more. Which one is right? Well, the answer is they both are. And they're more right when they're combined together creatively than when they try to approach problem solving on their own. So out of this comes, in the first place, an appreciation for the role that diversity plays. Secondly, an understanding that you are stronger by combining your various strengths together than you are on your own. But third, and more fundamentally, and this is the place that I wanted to go back to your idea with, is this isn't about spending money. It's about the meaning of spending money, what it means to each person. Why do you want to spend more? And why do you want to spend less? And now we're talking. But notice that the way that that has happened is that we haven't assumed that there is a single question that has a single correct answer. Whether to spend money on this or that may have a single correct answer. But in order to really give that answer, we first have to understand why it's important to you, why it matters. And so it may be something that is totally trivial, but it has immense meaning for you. And therefore, go ahead and spend the money, because the meaning is what is being gained as a result of this transaction. And that willingness to allow the other person to win creates a deeper and more stable and profound and intimate and successful relationship than any victory that you might gain by saving some small sum of money. And so it goes with every conflict.
That's beautiful. In your article, you start actually by saying that leadership is a skill. So is it a skill that can be learned by everybody, or do you need to bring in a packet of skills already in order to be able to do it right?
Yes. So thinking of it as a skill means in the first place that it's not inborn. We think of leaders as being born. Somebody is a born leader. But the reality is that everyone has to become a leader in their own life in terms of making decisions that matter to them. We can think of leadership as carving the riverbeds through which future generations will pass, creating the channels along which our relationship will flow. And in order to be able to do this, what we have to do really is to see that there are multiple skills that are required. The first of these skills that is most often left out is a skill of emotional intelligence, or the set of skills that are involved in emotional intelligence. Why? Because emotions help us with problem solving. They don't appear to, because they're intense, because they don't directly point at the solution, but in fact point backwards, inwards, into ourselves. But in doing so, what we discover is that our emotions help us figure out what the meaning of the thing is that we're concerned with. So if we look, for example, scientifically at what happens to people who have experienced strokes in the emotional processing centers of their brains, the thing that they can no longer do is make decisions of any kind. So what you are wearing right now, you chose this morning because you liked it. Like is an emotional processing. You eat what you like to eat. You pick out the groceries that you like. You do a variety of different things based on like or dislike. That's a relatively simple, low-level form of emotional intelligence. And then secondly, we have to figure out how to combine that with logical intelligence. So Daniel Kahneman has written a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his research in this area, along with Amos Tversky. And the point is, we have two hemispheres of our brains for a reason, because they help us with problem solving. So we have to figure out how to go across hemispheres and back and forth and up and down. Inside of our brains, within our bodies, within our emotions. And that is to create a whole brain approach to understanding the problem. And that gives us a capacity for leadership, because we are able to see things perhaps that others can't. So in conflict resolution, what makes me a leader is partly the fact that I am outside the problem and therefore have a perspective on it. I'm able to look back at it, which they can't do because they're in it. And why can't they? Because they're trapped in their emotion. So it's important to access the emotion, and then it's important to not be trapped in it, to turn it in the direction of problem solving. And that's where the leadership comes in. But in that form of leadership, that's not the president of a country that we are looking at necessarily, although the reality is that when we look at the great leaders of countries, people like Nelson Mandela, for example, we see people who have a very highly developed emotional intelligence, a capacity to speak to people from the heart, a capacity for empathy and compassion. And so these are fundamental things, I think, in leadership. Simply the question of love. Is love a part of our calculation or isn't it? Well, ordinary logic would tell you not only it isn't, but it shouldn't be. And if you look at most corporations and most nation states, there's very little love in them. But it's a fundamental part of all of our lives. And it's critically important to us. And why not turn it into a problem-solving strength, into a skill? And so we need skills in all of these areas. We need skills in listening to people's stories about what the problems are that they're facing, to learn how to turn their stories and narratives into information about what really matters to them. I hope this helps.
Yeah, it definitely helps, and it's interesting. You were saying so many things that I would like to ask a question about, because you're pointing out the crucial role of emotions in conflicts and how conflict can arise, but also that it is a necessary part of solving the conflict, because you need to address it, you need to give it a place. But you also said you need emotions in order to be able to make decisions. So could it also be that if you are in a conflict and you are highly emotional, so everything is in turmoil, or you shut yourself down from the emotions, I don't want to feel it, that it is more difficult to make decisions? And that, so an approach saying there is no room for emotions here in the mediation doesn't really lead to the best decisions. But in fact, if you open it up and you give the participants the possibility to really look at what's driving them, what are their emotions, that in fact the decision-making process in itself becomes better.
Yes, let's take an example. Let's take the example of anger. Anger is a very common emotion in conflict, but here are a couple of things about it. The first is nobody gets angry over things they don't care about. And therefore, all anger is about caring. Which conversation do you think will be most successful? The one that you're angry about, or the one about what you care about? So if we just ask people the question, why do you care so deeply about this issue? What makes you so passionate about it? Why does it matter so much to you? We will then shift the transition from problem solving at a relatively superficial level into emotionally informed problem solving that takes advantage of the anger by taking it to its ground, if you will, to the place where there's nothing deeper than that anger. So deeper than anger is fear, because people often becomes angry when they become frightened. And anger is a safer emotional expression than fear, because it feels more powerful. It's directed outward as opposed to fear, which is directed inward. Beneath fear is the perception of the possibility of grief and loss and pain and guilt. That's deeper than the fear, which is deeper than the anger. And if you invite someone into a conversation when they're angry about fear, if that's actually there, they will go there. If you ask the question, what are you afraid will happen? They will go there. If you ask, how would you feel if that happened? They will go to pain and grief and guilt and loss and shame and those experiences. And if you ask, why do you care about those things? Then you're at the level of love or caring or whatever. And now notice we have 4 completely different conversations. So what is important in every emotion is to, in the first place, acknowledge it, give it permission to exist. And in the second place, ask it questions that allow it to reveal its deeper essence. What is really involved in it? So couples have arguments over all sorts of things. I mentioned divorce mediation. One of the elements underneath anger in every divorce is grief. This is the loss of the most important relationship in your life up until now. What's not to grieve? And underneath grief is love for the other person, which isn't over yet, even if you want it to be. Even if you've had it with the other person, it still isn't over yet. Doesn't work that way. So when we can acknowledge those things, we then become free to use the information that is hidden beneath the surface as a way of exploring with the other person richer, more complex solutions than would have been possible if we had stayed at that superficial level. And the same thing happens at the level of logic. So we've been talking about emotion, but it is also possible to deepen logic so that it isn't just linear, it's multidimensional. And what an interest-based approach fundamentally is a multi-dimensional approach, at least a 3-dimensional approach, or 4 if we include emotions, that give us a freedom of movement that didn't exist before that. And so with leadership, what this allows us to do is to get beneath the narratives, the language of political discourse, which is asphyxiating, as Octavio Paz described it. It is fundamentally adversarial and relies on the existence of some enemy, some outsider, somebody who's opposed to us, because really there are 2 ways of creating a relationship with someone. For example, if you are someone who is coming to work in a new workplace, how do you form an alliance with the people who you're going to be working with? 2 ways. 1, find out who you both hate. That's the simplest. And the second is find out what you really enjoy about each other, what you have in common. That's more risky because we have to become vulnerable in the presence of someone who could hurt us. And yet, it's the more stable, the more lasting, the more collaborative. And all collaborative relationships involve that kind of risk, the risk of rejection, the risk of not being accepted by others, the risk even of being silent about things that matter because you're afraid of speaking up, where the reality is that all collaborations, all teams, all real communities, all couples require the willingness to be different. Out of that comes some new synthesis. So here's my way of describing that. There are 2 ways of combining things together, and mediators combine things together. Leaders combine things together. Here are the 2 ways. You can take hot water and cold water and add them together and produce lukewarm water. That's compromise. And often politics is referred to as the art of compromise. And leadership is thought of as essentially consisting of compromise. The second way is to take water and add flour and yeast and heat and make bread. And the bread has nothing in common, superficially, with the water, the yeast, the flour, or the heat. It's something new that only takes place when you mix them in the right combinations. And it's exactly the same way with the solutions to problems, whether professionally or interpersonally or organizationally. We have to find the right mixtures of different ingredients in order to come up with syntheses that are now more powerful than anything that could have been imagined before. The whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's what leadership is.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And so you're saying that a mediator needs to have leadership skills and leader needs to have mediation skills. And in fact, the two job descriptions are pretty similar. Both of them are helping others to look underneath, beneath the surface, and to look what really matters, and to look what is underlying and what is underlying. So you need to keep on asking questions and helping people to really have a frank look at what is there. And then the outcome of that is that you are not getting to some kind of compromise for just putting hot and cold water together, but to come up with something entirely new, thinking outside the box, you know, expanding the pie and coming up with something entirely new. So actually it's bigger and differently than just expanding the pie, because it's not a pie anymore. You know, you made bread out of water and dough, and that's a beautiful description, a new definition of what a mediator is, and I like it very much. To round off the conversation about your contribution, in the end you conclude with the question, who can do this? So who can make sure that we have mediative leadership? Okay, we all do it together. And because all of us need to do it, and stakeholders need to become owners, etc., etc. But somebody needs to start kicking off the ball. You know, like in a mediation, there is a mediator who helps others to make these decisions or do leadership or manage leadership, whatever. So who should start here in our mediation field?
Yes, so that's one form of leadership, is the leadership of initiation. Another form of the leadership is the leadership of completion. Another is about what happens in between. Detail orientation as opposed to big picture orientation. So the difficulty is that when we think about leadership as creating the path that takes us forward, and we ask what skills are needed in order to be able to do that, we will come up with a list of skills. And then if we ask the question, who is actually among us the best in all of those, the answer will be no one. And therefore, even if one person is out in front, sort of hacking away at the earth, trying to create this riverbed or this channel, that person has a partnership and an alliance with all the people who are standing together, helping to do all of the work that needs to be done in order to make the project successful. So because of the fact that we have hierarchy and we have ideas about superiority and inferiority, and because of a desire to dominate in order to get our interests met, because of the presence of power and the ways that power is used adversarially, what happens is that the leader who is out in front suffers from an illusion. And the illusion is that they have done it themselves, that they're the great one, and the others are not. And the others may actually go along with that because it's actually convenient for them to believe that. But the reality is that it is always a collaboration. And along with the art of leadership is the art of followership. And at the moment, I can tell you, having been a leader myself in a variety, the out front person in those various ways, in various capacities, as soon as people don't agree with you, your leadership just stops in its tracks. And they will tell you, but it's usually a little too late because you've gone on thinking that you are doing the right thing. And all of a sudden people are saying, not anymore. It looked right for a while, but now we think this way is right. And that's absolutely the right way to do it. So there is something in science that's known as swarm intelligence. And if you take a big bottle and you fill it full of jelly beans or little pebbles, and you show it to a group of people and you ask how many are there inside this bottle, the single most correct answer is the average of everybody's guess. And this has been shown in countless examples where it's not that one person has the correct answer, which sometimes they do, but generally not. And if they do, then they don't necessarily the next time. It's that the average of everybody's guesses together really comes the closest to being what the actual outcome is. So we're all over the map with regard to all kinds of skills. That doesn't make anybody better than anybody else. What it means is we now have to really acknowledge the importance of the person who says, no, I don't agree. That person is playing a critically important role. Or the person who says, yes, I do agree, when everybody else is holding back. So in all of these different ways, conflicts arise. And we can now see that conflict resolution is an essential component of leadership, in part because it helps us find that average.
Okay,
it empowers the voices of people who are otherwise left behind or left out or disregarded. And we do that way too much.
Okay, so does that mean that in fact we need to tap into swarm intelligence in order to get mediative leadership going as a conclusion? So as a concluding question, what is your main takeaway from the 7 keys as a whole, or maybe a specific publication that struck something on you? What's your take on that?
First of all, I want to thank all of the people who have worked on this project, Michael Lathes especially, but all of the people who have done such tremendous work in creating these 7 keys. They're a very, very valuable step forward. My metaphor for it is the metaphor of Alice in Wonderland, when she falls down the rabbit hole and then finds a key on a table to a door. But the door is very tiny. And so she has to slip down and shrink size in order to fit through the door. But then she forgets that she's left the key on top of the table, right? So the difficulty with the keys is, first of all, we have to have the right key for the right door. Secondly, the doors keep changing, so we need new sets of keys. Third, we have to recognize that the fundamental, this door that we are opening opens in 2 directions, inward and outward. And those need to be seen as one and the same. So the keys that unlock the door, the real keys, have to work in both directions. And they are evolving. So this is an important milestone to be able to identify those various steps forward. And hopefully in 5 or 10 years' time, it will all look terribly old-fashioned and simplistic. That's what we want. We want to evolve to a place where even the way that we were thinking is no longer helpful, because we have now come to a new way of thinking. And I think that's the real purpose of those keys, is to lead us to ways of thinking and feeling and being in the presence of conflict and in the presence of each other. That is requires a higher order of skill and produces a higher order of outcome.
Well, thank you very much for all of this. You've given a lot of food for thought. I'm pretty sure that everybody who's watching this video also needs to rewatch parts again, just to take in everything you've been saying. It was a big pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much for sharing all your insights. And yes, let's do indeed hope that if in 5 or maybe 10 years time, we look back at this interview, at the keys, at everything, and we think, oh yeah, wasn't it cute how we thought at that time? Look at where we are now. So that I like that future image to go to there. Thanks bunches.
Thank you, Menno. This is wonderful. I really enjoyed talking with you.